The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the dry earth into a bed of cracked bones. Poker Alice shifted the weight of the water pail against her hip, feeling the sun scorch her already burnt skin through the thin cotton of her dress. The hem brushed against the parched grass, stirring up little clouds of dust with each heavy step. The spring was nearly dry. She'd known it before she left the cabin, but hope had a cruel way of tugging a body forward even when common sense screamed to stay put. The world stretched around her, endless, empty, punishing. The only sounds were the scratch of the wind and the faint buzz of unseen insects gnawing at the silence. Halfway back she spotted him. At first she thought it was an animal, something dragged low and broken across the ground. But as she drew closer, a shape took form. A man sprawled face down in the dirt, his skin darker than any settler she'd ever known, his chest barely rising. His clothes were torn and stained with blood, dust caking his black hair. An arrow shaft protruded from his thigh, snapped in half. Poker Alice froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. A Navajo. Her father's voice rang loud in her memory. You see one out here alone, he's the bait. Others won't be far behind. Logic begged her to back away. To turn. To run. Instead she moved closer. The smell hit her first, coppery blood, sweat baked by the sun, a sour tang of fear. His lips were cracked, his tongue dry and stuck to the roof of his mouth. His body was no threat. Not now. Not like this. Still, her hands trembled as she knelt beside him. You got no right being here, she whispered, as if words could shield her from consequence. Poker Alice dipped her fingers into the warm water she carried and dribbled a few drops onto his lips. He flinched at the touch, a soft groan rising from his battered chest. His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Don't you dare die after I walked all this way, she muttered under her breath, pulling the scarf from her neck. She tore a strip and pressed it against the worst of his wounds, wincing as she worked. The desert stretched wide and empty around them, but Poker Alice knew better than to trust its silence. She had minutes, maybe less, before someone, or something, noticed the buzzard circling. Lord help me, she gritted. I'm gonna regret this. Her legs ached from dragging him across the uneven ground, muscles screaming protest. She made it to the sparse cover of scrub near the path, then paused, chest heaving. Her cabin was still a good mile off. No way she'd make it carrying him the whole way. The man stirred, his voice a low rasp. Water, he croaked. Already gave you some, she snapped, half panicked, half furious at herself for this stupidity. Ain't no sense in asking for what's running out. But she tipped the pail again, letting him sip from her cupped hand. His mouth moved in a word she didn't understand. Not English, not Spanish either. Maybe a prayer. Maybe a curse. The sky darkened slightly, a thin shadow passing over them. Poker Alice's heart dropped into her boots. She looked up, just a hawk riding the thermals. But the message was clear enough. Predators circled the weak. She made the decision before she could talk herself out of it. Bracing her shoulders under his weight, she hauled him upright, one step, then another, nearly buckling under the strain. The cabin came into view at last. A squat, weathered thing stitched together with stubbornness and prayers. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin, tired ribbon. Inside, she kicked open the trapdoor to the root cellar and lowered him into the cool darkness. He moaned as she jostled him, but she didn't stop until he was hidden below. She yanked a dusty quilt over him for warmth, then closed the door, the wood thudding hollowly. Only then did she allow herself to collapse against the wall, gasping. Sweat dripped into her eyes, stinging. Her hands were raw, scraped from the rough fabric of his clothes and the splinters of the cellar door. Her heart hadn't stopped racing since she first saw him. The sun dipped lower. Long shadows crept over the land like reaching fingers. Poker Alice loaded her old rifle, the one her father left her, and sat by the window peering out into the dying light. Every gust of wind, every creak of a branch, set her nerves jangling like a wire about to snap. She whispered under her breath, "You better live, Navajo. Otherwise, I'll be haunting you on the other side." She didn't know when sleep took her. One minute she was staring out at the emptiness. The next, a sound woke her, a low, rumbling vibration that hummed through the floorboards. She sat up fast, heart lurching. Through the narrow crack in the door she saw them. A line of horsemen, emerging from the dust like ghosts. Feathers in their hair, spears and rifles cradled loosely in their arms, silent and terrible as the judgment day itself. At least a dozen. They spread out around the cabin, a slow, deliberate circle. The horses stomped restlessly, snorting clouds of breath into the cool dawn air. The men said nothing. They didn't need to. The message was clear enough. We know he's here. We've come for him. Poker Alice's throat tightened until she could barely swallow. Her fingers tightened around the rifle stock. She could bolt the door, fire a few rounds, maybe take one of them down before they overran her. Or she could walk out there, alone, and pray she didn't die for a kindness. You did this, Poker Alice, she thought bitterly. You gave water to a dying man. And now death's come looking for you too. She forced herself to her feet, legs shaking. A figure dismounted from the lead horse, taller than the others, face painted in stark colors, eyes like black glass. He stood there waiting. The air felt thick, heavy with dust and something older, something wild and ancient that had ruled this land long before any white man had ever dreamed of crossing it. Poker Alice drew a slow breath, feeling the dry, cracked air scrape her lungs. Then she opened the door. The sunrise behind her turned her silhouette into a flickering shadow against the worn planks of the cabin. Her rifle hung heavy in her hands, but she kept the barrel pointed down. No sense starting a fight she couldn't win. The leader watched her, unmoving. Poker Alice's voice was rough, cracked from fear and dust. I ain't looking for trouble, she said. But if you mean to bring it, best know I'll stand my ground. The warrior said nothing. He lifted one hand, palm out, fingers spread, a gesture she didn't recognize, but it didn't feel hostile. Behind her, in the cellar, the wounded man shifted, groaning faintly. Every pair of eyes snapped toward the sound. Poker Alice gritted her teeth. No use hiding it now. You want him? She said, stepping forward, daring herself to match the weight of their stares. You better listen first. He was dying when I found him. Would have been buzzard meat without me. Still silence. She could feel their judgment, heavy as iron chains. Poker Alice squared her shoulders. I'm willing to hand him over. But not till I know he ain't gonna die just 'cause I pulled that arrow out. The leader's dark eyes narrowed. A low murmur passed among the warriors, almost like a river running under the sand. Then the leader nodded once, sharp, decisive. Poker Alice let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But deep in her gut, the fear didn't ease. Not even a little. Because out here in the dust and blood, mercy was just another kind of gamble. And Poker Alice had just laid her life on the table. The cold dawn wind slid over Poker Alice's skin, raising goosebumps even under her heavy coat. She stood in the dirt outside her cabin, rifle loose in her hands, facing a dozen mounted warriors who said nothing, did nothing except wait. The man at their head watched her like a hawk sizing up a wounded rabbit. His face was painted in stripes of white and red, and across his chest hung a necklace made of polished bone. He was lean, hardened, and utterly still. Only the dark glint of his eyes betrayed the life inside him, sharp, calculating. Behind Poker Alice, the wounded Navajo groaned again, muffled under the floorboards. If they hadn't heard it the first time, they heard it now. The lead warrior dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace. He stood a head taller than Poker Alice, his presence pressing against her like a rising tide. A single word escaped his lips, rough and clipped, "Brother." Poker Alice tightened her grip on the rifle. Every nerve screamed at her to run. But she knew better. Out here, showing fear was as good as bleeding in shark water. I found him dying, she said, pitching her voice low and steady. I gave him water. I pulled out the arrow. He ain't dead yet. The leader's gaze flickered to her rifle, then back to her face. Slowly, he lowered his hand, palm outward, signaling his men to hold. A tall warrior with a weathered face and feathers in his braid rode forward, speaking in a language Poker Alice didn't know. The leader listened, nodded once, then turned his full attention back to her. You, good woman, he said, voice rough as gravel. But he is ours. Poker Alice swallowed. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack. You'll take care of him? She asked, voice hitching despite herself. The leader didn't blink. He is blood. Blood does not leave blood behind. Something in his tone, the fierceness, the pride, sent a shiver down her spine. It reminded her of how her father used to talk about family before the fever took him. Behind the warriors, movement caught her eye. A second group, about 6 settlers on horseback, approached from the direction of town. Dust plumed behind them, guns slung across their saddles. Poker Alice's stomach dropped. The settlers had seen the Navajo riders too. And unlike Poker Alice, they wouldn't bother with words first. She turned back to the leader. Listen to me, she said urgently, stepping closer. The warriors shifted, murmuring, hands brushing the hilts of their knives. The leader held up a hand, silencing them. You got trouble coming, Poker Alice said. Those men, they won't ask questions. They'll shoot first. The leader's jaw tightened. His hand dropped to the tomahawk hanging from his belt. Poker Alice hesitated, then did the only reckless, stupid thing she could think of. She shoved the rifle into his hands. His brow furrowed as he took it automatically, as if insulted and impressed at once. "You'll need it more than me," Poker Alice said, voice shaking. "But we ain't gotta fight if we don't have to." A low rumble of hooves filled the air. The settlers were close now, maybe a minute out. Shouts drifted across the dry plain. "There's Injuns at Boone's place. I see 'em. Load up, boys." Poker Alice spun, heart pounding. 6 men, rifles raised, galloping fast. Dust clouded the horizon behind them, turning the rising sun into a blood-red smear. She turned back to the Navajo. "You want to live?" she snapped. "We fight together. Or we all die alone." For a moment, time hung frozen. Then the leader smiled, a slow, grim thing, and handed the rifle back. "You fight good," he said simply. Poker Alice racked around into the chamber. "I sure hope so." The Navajo melted into cover like smoke, slipping behind rocks and the low rise of the land, moving with a speed and silence that made Poker Alice's skin prickle. Poker Alice dashed for the side of the cabin, dropping to one knee. Her hands trembled, but she pressed the butt of the rifle into her shoulder, forcing the fear down. The settlers thundered in, pulling up hard, dust swirling around their horses' legs. Their leader, a wide man with a red face and a battered shotgun, bellowed at her. "Boone, get inside now. We'll handle this." Poker Alice rose slowly, rifle pointed down but ready. "They ain't here to fight," she called back. "Let them take their wounded and go." The settlers laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You gone soft, Boone? They're just waiting to scalp us soon as our backs are turned." A shot rang out, a warning round into the dirt by her feet. Poker Alice flinched but stood her ground. "Move aside, woman," the leader barked. "Ain't no place for traitors in this valley." Another shot cracked from behind her, not at the settlers but into the air, a sharp report that echoed across the plain. The Navajo made their presence known, rifles gleaming in the morning sun. They outnumbered the settlers but not by much. It was about to turn ugly fast. "Don't be a damn fool," Poker Alice shouted. "You start this fight, nobody's gonna see tomorrow." But fear ruled men's hearts quicker than reason. One of the settlers, a twitchy young man barely out of boyhood, jerked his rifle up, eyes wide and wild. The leader shouted, "Hold your fire." Too late. The boy squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but it was enough. The valley exploded into noise. Gunfire roared. Horses screamed. Dust boiled up around them, blinding Poker Alice as she hit the ground, rolling toward the shelter of the woodpile. Bullets tore splinters from the cabin wall above her head. She fired back instinctively, not aiming to kill, just to drive them back. The Navajo warriors moved like wolves, swift and coordinated, flanking the settlers with frightening precision. Poker Alice caught a glimpse of the young settler tumbling from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Another settler's horse bolted, riderless. The leader, red-faced and cursing, tried to rally his men, but panic spread faster than fire in a dry barn. One by one, the settlers turned tail and fled, pounding back toward town, their courage scattered to the wind. Silence fell, broken only by the labored breathing of the horses and the distant rattle of retreat. Poker Alice lay still for a moment, heart hammering, ears ringing. Slowly she rose. The Navajo leader approached, a shallow cut bleeding from his temple where a bullet had grazed him. He carried himself with the easy grace of a man who expected death but didn't fear it. He stopped a few paces from her, studying her like she was a puzzle with no right answer. "You fight brave," he said. Poker Alice gave a half-laugh, half-cough. "Ain't brave. Just stupid." A ghost of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. One of the other warriors called out in their tongue, pointing toward the wounded man hidden in the cellar. Poker Alice followed, heart twisting. The young Navajo she'd saved was awake, blinking groggily, pain etched deep into his features. His brother, or maybe his blood brother, knelt beside him, speaking softly. Poker Alice watched, feeling something shift inside her. Something deep and old as the land itself. She had crossed a line today. There was no going back to town now, no easy life waiting with the other settlers. Even if she lived through this, she would always be a traitor in their eyes. But looking at the wounded man's hand closing around his brother's wrist, seeing the life she'd helped save, Poker Alice felt a fierce, stubborn pride swell inside her. The Navajo leader turned to her. "You have no home here now," he said, not unkindly. Simply stating fact. Poker Alice nodded. "Never really did." He studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward the wide, empty land stretching beyond the valley. "Come," he said. With us. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a plea. It was an offer. Poker Alice looked back once at her cabin. The broken shutters, the bullet holes, the familiar worn shape of it against the rising sun. Home had never been four walls and a roof. Home was where you stood your ground. Where you chose who to fight for. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and stepped forward without hesitation. The warriors parted silently to let her pass. As she mounted a spare horse and rode out with them into the golden light, Poker Alice knew she wasn't running away. She was finally riding toward something worth fighting for. The smoke rose behind them, a black smear against the pale sky, marking the place Poker Alice used to call home. Her horse picked its way carefully across the broken ground, following the others in a tight line. Each hoofstep stirred little clouds of dust, the rhythm steady, almost hypnotic. The Navajo warriors moved with silent urgency, never looking back. Poker Alice kept her head high, refusing to glance over her shoulder, though her heart ached. What was left behind was ashes. She needed to remember that. Chayton, the tall warrior who had first spoken to her, rode slightly ahead, scanning the horizon. His presence was a steady weight beside her, like a stone in a rushing river. She didn't know what he thought of her, this pale-skinned woman dragging trouble behind her, but he hadn't pushed her away yet. That was something. The wounded man she had saved, Chayton's younger brother named Taza, rode slumped between two older warriors, his face pale, teeth clenched against the pain. Poker Alice caught his gaze once. He didn't smile, but he dipped his head slightly, a gesture of thanks. It warmed her more than the rising sun. Ahead, the land cracked open into a series of rocky gullies and hidden ravines. Good country for hiding and for fighting if it came to that. The group slowed, pulling into a hollow ringed with low stone outcrops. Chayton dismounted, speaking quietly to his men. Poker Alice slid from her horse, knees buckling a little from exhaustion, but she stayed upright. Pride stitched her spine straight. They needed to rest. Needed to plan. Poker Alice knew it as sure as she knew her own name. Trouble didn't just burn out with a cabin. It followed like a bloodhound on a scent. One of the warriors, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, passed her a canteen without a word. Poker Alice took it, nodding her thanks, and drank deep. The water was lukewarm and tasted of leather, but it might as well have been the finest wine. Chayton approached, rifle slung across his back, arms crossed. He studied her with the same measuring look he had when they first met. "You fight settlers," he said as if trying to piece her together. Poker Alice wiped her mouth and shrugged. "Fought men who'd kill anyone they didn't understand. Seems fair." He grunted, a sound halfway between amusement and disbelief. "You leave your world," he said. "Now you have no world." It wasn't cruelty. Just truth. Poker Alice let out a low breath, feeling the weight of it settle on her shoulders. She thought of the little church in town, the whispering women, the way men spat at her father for marrying a half-Mexican woman before he died. She thought of the narrow, pinched faces staring at her from behind curtained windows. "I didn't belong to that world," she said simply. Chayton's lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him yet. Then his face turned grim. "More settlers will come," he said. "Guns. Fire." He glanced at the wounded Taza, then back at Poker Alice. "They want war." Poker Alice's jaw tightened. "Then we give them one they won't forget." Across the hollow, warriors began preparing. Checking rifles. Sharpening blades. Binding wounds. Poker Alice watched, feeling a strange, fierce energy rise inside her. She was no warrior. She was a woman who had learned to skin a deer, to shoot straight, to mend her own clothes with bleeding fingers. But out here, survival was all that mattered. Skills she thought worthless became weapons. Smoke drifted on the breeze, not from the fire they'd left behind but fresh. Too much to be from a cooking fire. Poker Alice's gut twisted. Chayton saw it too. His body went tense. "They come," he said. There was no time for grand speeches. No time for plans drawn in the dirt. The warriors moved like a single creature, fluid and deadly. Poker Alice grabbed her rifle, heart hammering, and followed them into the rocks. The settlers came on horseback, a dozen strong, kicking up dust clouds behind them. Barton Clay led them, his red face twisted with anger, a battered rifle resting easy across his saddle. Poker Alice crouched behind a boulder, pressing her back against the stone. Her palms sweated against the rough wood of the rifle. The world shrank to the beat of her heart and the feel of the earth trembling under the hooves. A signal passed silently among the Navajo, a hand gesture, a nod. Poker Alice watched, absorbing it without understanding the language but somehow knowing the meaning. Wait. The settlers thundered into the hollow, shouting curses and threats. Chayton stepped out first, rifle held high, empty hands open. An offer. A chance to walk away. Barton Clay spat into the dust. You hiding behind savages now, Boone? He bellowed. You always were too soft to survive. Poker Alice rose from cover, rifle steady. Her voice rang across the hollow, clear and sharp. Turn back, Clay. You ain't wanted here. A ripple of laughter broke among the settlers. You think you can scare us, girl? Barton sneered. You're alone. Chayton's warriors rose as one, stepping into view. Shadows among the rocks, rifles gleaming. Barton's face lost a little color. Last chance, Poker Alice said, leveling her rifle. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then Barton Clay did what cowards always do. He acted out of fear. He fired. The shot went wide, but it shattered the fragile line between talk and blood. Rifles cracked, thunder rolling through the hollow. Horses screamed and bolted. Settlers dived for cover behind rocks. Dust and gunpowder choked the air. Poker Alice squeezed the trigger. A settler yelped and dropped his rifle, clutching his bleeding hand. Bullets whined past her ear. She ducked, reloaded, fired again. Chayton moved like smoke, swift and merciless. A settler charged him with a hatchet. Chayton sidestepped and dropped him with the butt of his rifle. Poker Alice crawled behind a fallen log, firing at shapes in the dust. A bullet grazed her arm, burning hot. She bit down a cry, gritting her teeth. Across the field, she spotted Barton Clay trying to rally his men, waving them forward like a drunken general. Poker Alice lined up the shot. Barton spotted her too late. Her bullet punched through the brim of his hat, sending it spinning into the dirt. Barton dropped flat, crawling for cover. The settlers' courage broke. They fled, scrambling onto their horses, dragging the wounded behind them. Poker Alice lowered her rifle slowly, chest heaving. The silence after the battle was thicker than the gun smoke. Bodies littered the ground, settlers and horses alike. Poker Alice stood slowly, blood trickling down her arm, watching the survivors disappear over the ridge. Chayton approached, his face unreadable. You fight good, he said again, but this time there was respect in his voice. Poker Alice looked around at the battered, bloody survivors standing with her. Her chest ached with exhaustion, pain, and something fiercer, pride. She had fought. Not for land. Not for pride. For something better. For loyalty. For life. The sun rose higher, painting the rocks gold and blood red. The smoke from her burned cabin drifted higher into the clear sky. Chayton touched her shoulder, a rare gesture of familiarity. Come. We leave. Poker Alice nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking forward, through fire, into something new. As she gathered her things and turned to follow the warriors into the rising sun, she didn't look back. The past was ashes. The future, whatever it was, would be written in fire and dust. The wind stirred the ashes where Poker Alice's cabin once stood. Nothing remained but blackened beams and shattered glass, half buried in the churned-up dust. She watched the smoke trail thin into the wide blue sky, a last whisper of a life she had outgrown. The warriors moved around her, gathering their wounded, tending to horses, speaking in low voices. No one rushed. They had learned patience in a land that showed no mercy. Every movement was deliberate, practiced, as if the earth itself might punish them for carelessness. Chayton knelt beside Taza, checking his brother's wounds with gentle hands. The younger man breathed easier now, his fever broken, the worst of the danger past. Poker Alice sat cross-legged nearby, cleaning her rifle with slow, methodical care, the repetitive motion grounding her against the whirlwind inside her chest. Chayton glanced up, his eyes catching hers across the distance. In that look there was no judgment. No pity. Only acknowledgement. She had fought. She had stood. She had bled for them. Now she belonged to no one, and yet somehow she belonged here. The sun slid lower, gilding the rocks with molten light. In the fading warmth, the warriors prepared to move again. They would not linger where death had walked. Poker Alice understood that now, deep in her bones. Chayton approached, his footsteps soft in the dust. You ride with us, he said, not as a question but as a truth already decided. Poker Alice nodded, feeling the weight of it settle into her shoulders and lift her heart at the same time. She strapped her rifle across her back, rising to stand beside him. The group set out as twilight deepened, riding in loose formation across the broken land. The horses' hooves made no sound against the hard earth. Shadows stretched long across the valley, swallowing the wounds and scars of the battlefield behind them. They rode until the stars pricked the sky, cold and distant. The world shrank to the sound of breathing, the creak of leather, the soft jingle of bridles. At a small spring hidden by scrub, they made camp. Fires were forbidden, too dangerous with angry men still hunting the horizon, so they ate cold and silent, wrapped in cloaks against the gathering chill. Poker Alice sat a little apart, gazing at the stars. They burned fierce and white, scattered like spilled salt across the heavens. She remembered sitting by her cabin once, wishing on stars that never answered. Now she needed no wishes, only will. Chayton joined her, sinking to his haunches with the easy grace of a man born to the wild. "You choose hard road," he said after a while, voice low. Poker Alice smiled faintly. "Ain't no other kind worth walking." He grunted approval, then studied her with a solemnity that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "Tomorrow we go deeper into mountains. Hard country. Safe country." "I'll keep up," she said, fiercer than she intended. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You will." They sat in silence after that, the stars turning slowly overhead, the night breathing around them. When sleep finally claimed Poker Alice, it was not the thin, haunted sleep of fear. It was deep and dreamless, anchored in the knowledge that she had chosen her path with open eyes. Morning broke hard and fast. A scout returned, breathless, warning of riders on the horizon, not settlers but soldiers from the nearest fort. Word of the fight had traveled faster than any of them had expected. There was no time for careful retreat. The warriors saddled up, swift and sure. Poker Alice tightened the straps on her horse, checking her rifle, adrenaline sharpening every sense. Chayton rode to her side. "You ride close. You see chance, you run." She shook her head. "I'm done running from cowards." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, a warrior's salute. The soldiers crested the ridge, banners snapping in the wind, rifles gleaming under the hard morning sun. They formed a line across the valley mouth, cutting off the easiest escape. Poker Alice felt the old familiar fear rise, a cold knot twisting her gut, but she forced it down. Fear had ruled her once. No more. Chayton signaled, sharp and crisp. His warriors spread out, moving low and fast across the rocks, becoming part of the land itself. Poker Alice followed, keeping her body low, heart hammering in her ears. The soldiers called for surrender, their voices harsh and commanding. Barton Clay, riding at their side, pointed directly at her, shouting, "There she is, traitor. String her up with the rest." Chayton gave her a glance, questioning, almost apologetic. Poker Alice raised her rifle and answered with fire. The first soldier jerked backward, screaming, his rifle clattering from his hands. The line wavered. The warriors struck then, swift and brutal, using the rocks and gullies to their advantage. Gunfire roared, smoke filling the valley. Poker Alice moved with them, every sense honed sharp as a blade. She fired, reloaded, moved, fired again, always staying close to cover, always keeping Taza and the others in her sight. She caught a glimpse of Barton Clay trying to rally the soldiers, his face red and twisted with rage. She set her sights on him, breathing slow and even. When she fired, it wasn't hate that guided her hand. It was justice. Clay screamed as her bullet shattered his shoulder, knocking him from his horse. He writhed in the dust, his cries lost in the chaos. The soldiers' line broke under the pressure, scattering in panic. Some fled. Others threw down their weapons and raised shaking hands. The battle ended in a wild, breathless silence. Poker Alice staggered to her feet, smoke stinging her eyes, muscles aching from the strain. Chayton stood nearby, blood seeping from a shallow graze across his ribs, but alive. His warriors gathered around him, battered but triumphant. Taza limped to Poker Alice's side, leaning heavily on a staff. "You fight like spirit woman," he said, voice thick with admiration. Poker Alice smiled through the pain. "Just stubborn." The surviving soldiers were rounded up, stripped of weapons and sent back toward the fort on foot, a hard lesson carved into their pride. The warriors would move again, deeper into the wilderness where no army dared follow. But for now they had won a breath of freedom. As the sun climbed higher, Poker Alice climbed a ridge overlooking the battlefield. Below her, smoke curled lazily into the bright sky. The valley stretched wide and broken, scarred by fire and blood, but still standing, just like her. Chayton joined her, silent. Together they watched the land heal itself, slow and stubborn as all wild things must. "You have name with us now," Chayton said at last. "Kiona. Stands for Brown Hills. Strong. Steady." Poker Alice felt her throat tighten. She had no words, but she nodded, accepting it with the solemnity it deserved. The wind picked up, tugging at her hair, carrying away the last ashes of her old life. She didn't know what waited ahead, hardship, hunger, maybe death. But she knew she would meet it standing tall. Out here, survival was the only law. And Poker Alice, Kiona now, had proven herself worthy. As the warriors mounted and rode into the heart of the wild land, Poker Alice turned her horse and followed, her rifle across her back, her heart fierce and free. The dust swallowed their trail behind them, erasing the past. Only the future lay ahead, raw, untamed, and waiting. The wind didn't howl that day. It whispered, soft and cutting, the kind of cold that made folks turn their collars and mind their own business. Samuel Coleridge, a man with more dust than pride clinging to his boots, rode into Cold Creek not for trouble, but for a bag of grain and a part for his wagon wheel. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words all week, and he liked it that way. Silence didn't judge. Silence didn't ask about the wife buried under the cottonwood tree or the mortgage stamped in red ink. But silence broke that day. Behind the saloon, where old crates and rusted spittoons lay forgotten, a small crowd had gathered like flies to rot. No music, no auction bell. Just murmurs, eyes flicking toward the alley then away again, as if seeing it might brand their souls with shame. He dismounted slow, tied his horse loose. Curiosity wasn't virtue, but something about the hush behind that saloon gripped him. And then he saw her. She wasn't crying. That would have been easier. Her dress was plain and patched, the hem muddied from travel. One hand rested over her swollen belly, the other hung limp. Blonde hair, tangled and wind-bitten, framed a face too pale for summer. A man stood beside her, bearded, mean-eyed, smelling of sour whiskey. Another leaned against a barrel, arms crossed, a twisted smile on his face. Brothers, Samuel would later learn. In-laws, to be precise. The kind that made a man wish the law bit harder. Don't look like much, one of them muttered to a fat merchant with dirty fingernails. But she's healthy enough. Child's near to term. Strong stock. Could be of use if you got hands need warming. Someone chuckled. Another spat. Samuel's jaw tightened. The girl didn't flinch. Didn't speak. Just stared down at the cracked ground like she might vanish if she stared long enough. That's enough, the merchant said. I'm not talking no charity case with a mouth to feed. She ain't charity. She's kin. Husband passed, left debts. We're settin' things right. Someone muttered, ain't no preacher at this auction. Samuel took a slow step forward. One of the in-laws turned. You lookin' to buy, stranger? He sneered. The girl lifted her eyes then. Briefly. Just once. They locked with Samuel's. Not pleading. Not broken. But hollow. The kind of hollow you get when the world keeps taking and never says sorry. No, Samuel said. Just lookin'. But he wasn't. There were stories in the girl's silence. Rage, shame, quiet defiance. Something twisted in his chest. He'd buried a child once. Just one. Born too early. Buried beside his wife the next week. That wound never healed. But somehow this girl's silence brushed right up against it. The bearded man laughed. Don't worry. She ain't got the strength to protest. Never did. Always soft-spoken. Makes it easier. The girl's lips moved. No sound came. But she blinked like a storm was behind her eyes. Where's the sheriff? Someone whispered. Probably paid not to see. Samuel felt heat rise in him. Not the kind that made fists fly. The colder kind. Like frostbite working up from the bones. He stepped closer. How much you want? The merchant and both in-laws turned. The girl did not. Bearded one squinted. You serious? Samuel nodded. A long silence. $50, the man spat. And a rifle. If you got one. Samuel reached into his coat. Tossed a leather pouch. Then slowly unhooked the old Winchester from his back. You're a damn fool, someone muttered. The bearded man snatched the rifle like it was candy. Coins were counted without ceremony. She's yours. Samuel didn't move. What's her name? Does it matter? He looked at her. She looked back. Yes. The girl's voice came, small and cracked. Eleanor Dumont. It broke something open in him. A name. A voice. That's all it took to turn her from object to person. He offered his hand. She didn't take it, but she stepped toward him. That was enough. They walked through town like ghosts. The sun dipped low. No one stopped them. A few eyes lingered, but most turned away. Guilt makes cowards of decent men. He helped her into the wagon. Still no tears. Still no questions. She sat with her hands folded over her belly, staring ahead like a woman sentenced to something she didn't understand. The wagon creaked as it rolled out of Cold Creek. Dust rose in swirls behind them. They didn't speak for a long while. Finally, Samuel said, "You don't owe me nothing. You understand?" She didn't answer, but she turned to look at him. Just for a second. Then forward again. The sky grew purple. Stars blinked through like shy children. They stopped for the night in a hollow near the riverbed. He built a small fire. Gave her his coat. She took it but didn't speak. He offered jerky and cornbread. She ate without tasting. "I ain't a man who saves people," he muttered. "Just didn't want to leave you there." Still silence. The fire cracked and danced. She finally spoke. Quiet, raw. "They weren't always cruel." He didn't answer. Some truths didn't need echoing. "They said I was a burden," she said. "Too much to feed. Said my husband's death made me worthless." Samuel stared into the flames. "They were wrong." She looked at him. Then back to the fire. "I don't know where we're going," she whispered. "Neither do I." The baby kicked. She flinched. He noticed. "You all right?" She nodded once. Then asked, "Why'd you do it?" Samuel hesitated. "Then, because I saw my wife's eyes in yours." Eleanor Dumont blinked. The firelight shimmered on her cheek. He rolled out a blanket for her. Took the hard ground himself. They didn't speak again that night. But something shifted. A brittle warmth beneath the cold. As Samuel stared up at the stars, he wondered, not for the first time, if redemption came quietly. Not through grand gestures, but through one broken soul reaching for another. And in that still night, with fire low and frost creeping near, Eleanor Dumont turned toward him in the dark and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer, just closed his eyes, because maybe that was the beginning. And tomorrow he knew would ask everything from both of them. The morning came heavy with fog. Not the light, drifting kind, but thick as wool, wrapping the world in a breathless hush. Samuel woke before dawn as he always did. Years on the land had trained him to rise with the cold. But today he lingered a moment longer, watching the still shape on the blanket beside the embers. Eleanor Dumont hadn't moved much through the night. Curled inward, both arms wrapped around her middle like she feared something might be taken from her in the dark. Her breathing was shallow, steady, like a woman who had learned not to make noise, even in sleep. He stood, brushed the frost from his coat, and set to making coffee. Quiet, deliberate motions. The way he used to move around wild animals. By the time she opened her eyes, steam curled from the pot and the fire had grown to a soft amber glow. She didn't speak. Just sat up slowly, one hand steadying herself, the other cupping her belly. "Coffee?" he asked. She nodded once. He poured her a tin cup. She took it with both hands, sipping slow, the metal rattling against her lip. "I figure we can reach the ranch by sundown," he said. "It ain't fancy but it's dry. Got a bed. Stove works fine when she's fed right." Still no words. But he didn't push. After all, silence wasn't always absence. Sometimes it was armor. They rode in quiet. The wheels groaned beneath them. The mule snorted now and then, swishing its tail against imagined flies. Trees crept by like ghosts in the mist, their trunks thin and wet as old bones. She asked nothing. Not about the ranch. Not about him. Not even where he came from. So he told her anyway. "I was raised in Kansas," he said. "Dustier than here. Meaner too. My father was a preacher. My mother died birthing my sister. She didn't last past 6 winters." No response. Just the rhythm of hooves. "I left at 16. Thought I'd find gold. Found cattle instead." He glanced at her. Still she said nothing. But her fingers clenched slightly in her lap. "My wife Miriam was better than I ever deserved. She had freckles like cinnamon. Could outshoot me with a rifle and outbake any woman in the county. We lost our first child in the spring frost. She passed 2 months later." A breath escaped him, half memory, half wound. Eleanor Dumont turned her head just slightly toward him. Then forward again. But something in her shoulders softened. When they reached the ranch, the fog had lifted. Sunlight cut across the land in gold ribbons, making the frost sparkle like it had secrets to keep. The house stood plain and weathered, 2 windows missing shutters, porch slanted. But it held the air of something honest. Samuel helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch her longer than needed. She moved slow but steady, each step cautious. "Let me show you inside." She followed him through the creaking door. The interior was spare, wooden walls, simple table, 2 chairs, iron stove, and a room off to the side with a bed barely large enough for one. His wife's quilt still lay across it, She paused in the doorway, reached out, ran her hand along the edge of the patchwork like it might bite her. I can take the barn tonight, he offered. You rest. Her voice was barely there. No, I'm not helpless. He nodded, not sure what to say to that. So he said nothing. She settled slowly onto the bed, boots still on, back upright. He returned with a basin of warm water and left it beside her without a word. Outside, he chopped wood until his arms burned. Not because the stove needed it, but because silence sometimes roared louder than screams. By nightfall, she had washed and folded the quilt down. Her hair was damp, her face a little less pale. But her eyes, those stayed guarded. Supper was bread, beans, and dried apples. She ate slow, mechanically, like someone who hadn't tasted food in months but had forgotten how to savor. As they sat across the table, he finally said, "You're safe here." She didn't meet his eyes. "Safe don't mean not scared," she said, barely above a whisper. He nodded. "I know." A long pause stretched between them. Then, softly, "His name was Daniel. My husband. He wasn't cruel. Just tired. Died of fever after the child quickened." Samuel listened, hands still. "His family said I owed them. That I'd brought the sickness. That I'd eaten more than I worked. They told me to leave, but not before making sure I was taken care of." Her voice broke slightly on that last part. "I'm sorry," he said. "They called me a burden," she continued. "Said I'd cursed them." He looked at her hands, thin, rough, trembling faintly. "You're not a burden," he said. She looked up then, sharply, as if the words slapped her. "You don't know me. Don't need to." Silence. "Then, you still gonna make me your wife?" she asked. He shook his head. "Only if you ask me to." Her breath caught. "I won't ask," she said after a long pause. "Then I won't push." They sat in that stillness, both holding their scars like keepsakes. The next few days passed in quiet rhythm. She swept the floor, cooked what she could. Sometimes she sat on the porch and stared at nothing for hours. Other times she helped feed the mule, her hand brushing its nose like she was remembering softness. He kept his distance. Let her own the silence. Then one evening, while he mended a fence near the paddock, she came out with a steaming cup. "Coffee," she said, holding it out. He blinked. Took it carefully. "Thank you." She didn't reply. But she stood there close. Not touching. Just near enough that he felt her presence in his ribs. "I used to hum," she said quietly. "When I was a girl. I haven't in a long time. Maybe you will again." She didn't answer. But the next morning, as she folded laundry on the porch, he heard the faintest sound, barely there. A note. Maybe two. A hum, broken but brave. He didn't look up. Just kept whittling the wood in his hands. That night, rain came heavy. Thunder rolled far off. He lit the lantern and sat by the stove. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked. He set down the knife. "I think they believe in us," he said. She nodded. Stepped into the light. "You've been kind," she said. "But I'm still afraid." "So am I. I don't want to be owned." "You're not." "I don't want to be saved." "Then just stay." The silence between them turned warm, for once. She walked over, sat across from him. The lantern flickered, painting her face in gold and shadow. Her voice was stronger now. "I don't know how to be loved." "You don't have to." She blinked. "You just have to sit here," he said, "and not run." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached across the table. Not for his hand, but to place her palm flat beside his. A nearness. A beginning. Outside the wind howled. But inside, something fragile and sacred held still. And in that quiet moment, as thunder echoed in the hills, Samuel realized. She wasn't wrapped in silence anymore. She was unfolding. Spring came early that year. The snow that clung to fence posts melted into the thirsty earth, and the ground cracked open like it had something to say. Buds swelled on trees that hadn't dared bloom in seasons. And on the porch of a weathered ranch house just outside Cold Creek, a woman stood barefoot in the early sun, one hand on her belly, the other resting on the porch rail. She didn't smile. But she breathed deeper. Samuel watched from the field, one boot in the stirrup, as the mule shifted under his weight. The sight of her standing there, quiet, real, still learning how to take up space again, did something to him he couldn't name. Eleanor Dumont had begun rising before him some mornings, making coffee and setting the table with deliberate care. She didn't talk much, but the silence between them had softened. It wasn't fear anymore. It was soil. And something had started growing. She asked to help him mend the barn roof. He said no. she insisted. He handed her nails, showed her how to set them. Her hands were slow but certain. When she slipped on the shingles and let out a gasp, he caught her. Just a touch, his hand at her back, her palm flat on his chest. For a moment, neither moved. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, cheeks flushed. But the heat wasn't from fear. In the evenings, she sat on the porch sewing baby clothes from old curtains and worn flannel shirts. Her fingers moved like memory, thread, needle, breath. She'd never had much, but she wanted something soft waiting when the child arrived. Samuel built a cradle in the shed. Worked on it at night by lantern light, shaping the wood slow and clean. When she found it one morning, she didn't say a word. Just ran her hand along the curve of the frame and left a jar of jam by his coffee cup. In town, rumors had begun to change shape. At first, he bought her at auction. Then, she don't talk much. Must be simple. But lately, he's building her a porch swing. She's teaching his mule to bow its head for sugar. People talked. People always did. But Eleanor Dumont held her chin a little higher now. And Samuel never answered back. He'd never had use for town opinions before, and he wasn't about to start now. One afternoon, she asked to go with him to the general store. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "I want to see something besides these four walls." She wore her late husband's hat low, her old dress tight across her belly. Her boots didn't match. But she walked into that store like a woman who remembered who she was. Mrs. Dellinger, the storekeeper's wife, raised a brow. "You look well, dear." Eleanor Dumont's voice didn't waver. "I feel well." They bought flour, beans, and a bit of blue ribbon. When Samuel asked about the ribbon, she said nothing. But later at home, she tied it around her braid and looked at herself in the window. For the first time, she saw something worth looking at. That night, under the oil lamp's hum, Samuel brought out an old record box. Not music. Letters. Recipes. The burnt-edge photo of his late wife. "She was beautiful," Eleanor Dumont said, holding the picture carefully. "She was," he said. Silence. Then, "and kind?" "The kindest." Eleanor Dumont traced the edge of the photo. "I'm not her." "No," he said. "You're not." She looked up, bracing. "But you're here." Her eyes welled. But no tears fell. Instead, she said, "I want to plant tomatoes." He blinked. "Next to the fence," she added. "And lavender. I remember the smell from when I was little. We'll get seeds this week." "Good." He watched her carefully. Something was shifting. Not just in her but around her. As if the house had exhaled. As if the land knew it had another woman to care for now. And then came the knock. It was late. Too late for neighbors. Samuel stood from the table, reached for the rifle hanging near the door. Eleanor Dumont froze. The knock came again. When he opened the door, 3 men stood outside. One had a wide hat and narrow eyes. Another chewed tobacco like it was his only skill. The third he recognized. Eleanor Dumont's brother-in-law. "Evenin', Coleridge," the man said with a crooked smile. Samuel didn't return it. "You're not welcome here. We just come to check on kin." "She's not yours to check on. She's carrying blood," the man said, stepping forward. "Family blood." Eleanor Dumont appeared behind Samuel, one hand resting on the doorframe. "She told you no," Samuel said. "That ought to be enough." "Easy there," the man grinned. "Ain't here to fight. Just talk. Maybe take her home." "She is home." The man's eyes narrowed. "You think buying her changes that?" Eleanor Dumont's voice came clear and strong. "You're not taking me." Samuel glanced at her. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. The brother-in-law spit in the dirt. "You think you'll raise that child without our name? Without what's owed? You gave up rights when you sold me," she said. "I'm not your debt." He laughed, but it was bitter. "This ain't over." Samuel shut the door in their faces. Eleanor Dumont didn't tremble. Not then. But later, when she sat on the porch in the dark, he heard her breath catch. He stepped outside, blanket over one arm. "You knew they'd come," she whispered. He sat beside her. "I figured. They want the child. They can want all they like." Pause. Wind stirred the trees. "I'm scared," she said. "So am I." She turned to him. Her face was bare, open. "I don't want to run again." "You won't." She looked at him then. For a long time. And in that look, something passed between them, like hands touching without touching. He draped the blanket over her shoulders. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "Maybe I will ask." "Ask what?" She looked away but smiled just barely. "To be your wife." Samuel said nothing. Just reached over and took her hand. Held it. Let the warmth of that single gesture speak louder than any vow. Inside, the fire crackled low. And outside, the seed she'd asked to plant waited beneath the thawed ground, ready like her to begin again. Eleanor Dumont woke with a weight pressing on her chest, not from the child she carried but from the quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that came before a storm. The birds had not yet started their morning song. The wind outside moved in low sighs. Something had shifted in the air, though she couldn't say what. She pressed her hand against her belly and waited. Samuel was already outside, splitting wood by the barn. She could hear the measured rhythm of his axe, each strike a steady beat in the song of their days. Reliable. Familiar. Safe. But safety, Eleanor Dumont had learned, was often an illusion, a blanket too thin to cover what waited beneath. She stepped outside into the golden light, wrapped in her shawl, her braid loose down her back. Samuel saw her and lowered his axe. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded but didn't smile. Something's wrong. He didn't question her. He'd come to trust her instincts like he trusted the seasons, unpredictable but rarely mistaken. By noon the wind had picked up. Dust danced across the hills and the mule paced near the fence. Eleanor Dumont stayed close to the house, eyes scanning the horizon. When the riders came, they came slow, deliberate. 3 of them again, same men as before but this time armed and less courteous. The brother-in-law led, face smug beneath his hat. Samuel stepped down from the porch, rifle across his back, jaw tight. Eleanor Dumont stood in the doorway, one hand resting on her stomach, the other on the frame. "Afternoon," the man said, spitting to the side. "We come for what's ours." Samuel didn't move. "You came for trouble. You signed nothing. Ain't no preacher tied you to. She's still legally ours and that baby's kin." "She's not yours," Samuel said, his voice low. "She never was." The man dismounted, slow, drawing a folded paper from his coat. "Got a signature here," he said, waving it. "Her late husband owed us half the homestead. Since he's gone and she's carrying his heir, we figure we're owed what's left." "You'll get nothing," Eleanor Dumont said from the doorway, her voice cold as iron. He turned toward her. "You think this man can protect you? He's got nothing. You think this shack and his silence make you safe?" "I don't think," she replied. "I know." He stepped toward the porch. Samuel raised the rifle. "That's far enough." The man stopped. "You gonna shoot your wife's family?" he sneered. Samuel didn't blink. "If I have to." The man laughed, backing off. "You think this ends here? You think a paper won't find its way to the court in Cold Creek?" "Go ahead," Samuel said. "Bring the law. But you'll lose. 'Cause I married her, yesterday morning." Pastor Evans signed the record. Witnessed by his wife and the town clerk. The man froze. "You're lying." "Go check." Eleanor Dumont stepped down beside Samuel. She took his hand, right there in front of the men who once sold her. "I chose him," she said. "That's what you never understood. You can't sell someone who doesn't belong to you." The man's eyes burned. But he knew he'd lost. Not just in law but in presence. Still he left a warning. "You'll regret this. One day when the child's sick or hungry or looking for a name, and you got nothing left to give." Eleanor Dumont held her head high. "Then I'll give them this story. Of how we stood our ground." He turned and rode off without another word. The others followed. Silence returned to the homestead, but it was heavier now, like a rope pulled too tight. Samuel set the rifle aside, shoulders dropping. "You really went into town and married me?" Eleanor Dumont asked, teasing a little edge into her voice. "I did," he said. "Didn't want to presume. Figured you'd say no. I was planning to ask you today." He looked at her. "Well, beat you to it." She smiled then. A real one. Not wide but warm and unguarded. That evening the wind calmed. The sun dipped low, spilling orange across the earth. They sat on the porch swing he'd finally finished, her head resting against his shoulder. Inside the cradle waited. Beside it, a stitched name, her own, embroidered into a small quilt. Eleanor Dumont stared out across the prairie, then whispered, "You think they'll come back?" "Maybe. But they won't get through me. I believe that." Pause. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said. "You're not safe," he replied. "Not in this world. But you're not alone." She closed her eyes. That night, she lay in his bed without fear. No promises spoken, but a quiet vow lived in the spaces between them. Outside, the ground shifted again, spring digging in, stubborn and slow. And within her, a different seed turned toward the light. The fire came at night. Not a thunderclap blaze, but a slow, crawling beast that crept from the edge of the fields and found breath in the dry hay. By the time Samuel smelled the smoke, it was already too late for the barn. He bolted from the bed, shotgun in one hand, pulling on boots with the other. Eleanor Dumont followed, robe dragging behind her, one hand braced on the doorframe, the other cradling the child still beneath her ribs. The flames had reached high into the rafters. Sparks flew like angry stars. The mule cried from its tether, wild-eyed, desperate. Samuel ran in, coat over his head, teeth clenched against the heat. He cut the rope, slapped the animal's flank and stumbled back, coughing, eyes watering. The barn groaned. A beam crashed behind him. Eleanor Dumont shouted his name, her voice a sharp thing in the night air. He staggered toward her, smoke curling from his shoulders, and she caught him halfway to the porch, pulling him back like a tethered soul from hell. Neighbors saw the fire. They came with buckets, blankets, and rough, weary hands. Mrs. Dellinger brought bread. The young storekeeper ran barefoot carrying a jug of water. Someone, Samuel didn't know who, said they'd seen a rider leave the property not long before the blaze. But no one spoke the name. No one needed to. Samuel didn't curse. He didn't shout. He watched the barn collapse in on itself like a prayer unanswered, then turned and walked back to the porch. Eleanor Dumont followed, hand tucked in his. The next morning, smoke still drifted in gray threads across the sky. Ash clung to the windows. The cradle inside the house had been untouched. So had the quilt. Eleanor Dumont sat at the table, a shawl wrapped tight around her. Her eyes were steady, her voice quiet. "They want to break us," she said. Samuel poured water into a tin cup, set it before her. "They won't," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "I believe you." He reached across the table, took her hand gently. His calluses had softened a little in the months since she'd come. Or maybe hers had matched his. Later that week, Eleanor Dumont went into labor. It came sudden, in the blue hush before dawn, with the wind howling low and fierce across the plains. Samuel didn't panic. He gathered water, boiled cloth, called for the neighbor woman who'd delivered 3 of her own. Eleanor Dumont gritted her teeth and gripped the bedpost until her knuckles bled white. The pain was long. Bro. But when the baby's first cry filled the room, it was louder than the fire had been. A boy, dark-haired, soft-lunged, furious at being born into such a world. Eleanor Dumont wept, cradling him to her chest. Samuel didn't cry. But he stepped outside, stared at the rising sun, and whispered his wife's name into the wind, not Miriam but Eleanor Dumont. She was his wife now, and this was their world. The weeks after were quiet but not still. They rebuilt the barn with the help of neighbors who no longer whispered behind hands. Eleanor Dumont planted tomatoes along the fence and lavender beneath the window. The baby's laughter came soft and slow, but when it came, it lit the house like a second sunrise. One day Samuel found her sitting in the dirt, baby in her arms, ribbon in her hair, smile tucked into the corner of her mouth like a secret she no longer had to keep. "I thought I'd die out here," she said. "You didn't." "No," she said. "I lived." And Samuel, who had buried one family, realized he'd grown another. Not through blood but through choice. Through fire. Through silence that had become speech and wounds that had become roots. That fall they held a second wedding, this time with neighbors present, and rings traded beneath the cottonwood where his first wife lay. Eleanor Dumont placed a small flower on the grave. Not for jealousy, but for gratitude. At supper Mrs. Dellinger raised a glass and said, "May the child carry both their names." He did. In town no one questioned them anymore. They were a unit. A man who spoke little but protected much. A woman once sold, now seen. And a child born in the middle of both their storms. Sometimes, on still nights, Eleanor Dumont would sit on the porch and hum. And Samuel, rocking the baby in his arms, would close his eyes, not to rest but to remember how it all began. With a whisper behind a saloon. With a silence that needed no saving. And with a man who didn't ask for love, but waited long enough to earn it. Let them write history in books about the wars and outlaws. This one would be written in soil and ash and soft blue ribbon. And for those who ever doubted whether broken things bloom, Eleanor Dumont had her answer. She lived it. And in that wind-swept prairie, under skies that knew sorrow and sun, a woman once auctioned now sat as a matriarch, head high, heart full. Because love on the frontier wasn't built in ballads. It was carved with patience, lit by fire, and kept alive by those brave enough to stay.